So the three topics I want to discuss today to introduce the session, really to introduce the course, are representation, representationalism, and anti-representationalism. And I want to begin by telling what we'll see later on Rorty calls a big swooshy geistesgeschichtlich meta-narrative to set the stage for the authors and texts that we'll read and the issues that we'll worry about for the rest of the course. One of the meta-philosophical issues that Rorty's reception raises is just how enlightening one finds or ought to find stories like that, how much specifically philosophical light they actually shed. One way of thinking about Rorty's philosophical methodology is as making a Hegelian claim that in the end, the only specifically philosophical form of understanding is these retrospective, reconstructive narratives. And I take it to be a sociological fact that one's sympathy for Rorty is generally directly proportional to the extent to which you do find stories of this sort enlightening. But as I say, that's already a controversial matter. The central focus is the concept of representation. And one way of putting what's most fundamentally at issue in the course is to ask the radical Hegelian question whether representation is something that has a nature or something that has a history. Does it belong in a box with electrons and sulfur, or with freedom and the right to vote? Is it a proper subject of investigation by the Naturwissenschaften or the Geisteswissenschaften? I'm going to begin by by employing the moderate Hegelian strategy of asking about the nature of the phenomenon by looking at the history of the concept. Let me start with a terminological note. Representation is a term that exhibits what Sellers called the notorious ing-ed ambiguity between representings and representeds. In this respect, it belongs in a box with other central philosophical terms, such as experience, perception, judgment, belief, desire, intention, and even action. Sellers thought that a lot of philosophical confusion resulted from running together the ing and the ed side of terms like experience. Here you can think of Berkeley, who systematically ran back and forth between these notions. So I take it it's a good practice, a good bit of philosophical hygiene, to use representation to refer to the relation between representings and representeds, and to use those two terms for the two kinds of relata that presumably become representings and representeds by playing the right role in relations of representation. So overall, I want to talk first about just how central the concept of representation was to Enlightenment epistemology and philosophy of mind, and to philosophy since then. Understanding early modern philosophy as revolving around this axis is a thought we owe to Kant, who first brings the term representation, his Vorstellung, to the center of the philosophical stage. And then second, I want to talk about the philosophical ideology that Rorty, among others, calls representationalism. And finally, I want to sketch two different argumentative paths to the rejection of that ideology, two initially disparate but eventually converging forms of anti-representationalism, Rortyian pragmatism and what Hugh Price makes of expressivism. The contemporary anti-representationalist tradition that we'll be focusing on is in some sense subterranean, and not a few people think it's subversive of commitments constitutive of contemporary philosophy. But the figures we're going to read are not, if not mainstream, are hardly marginalized figures. The four of them, Rorty, Cheryl Mesack, Simon Blackburn, and Hugh Price, among the things we'll read by each of them are presidential addresses that they gave to the APA, the Aristotelian Society, and so on. So these are not marginalized figures that we're talking about, even if the view that brings them together, their concern with anti-representationalism, even if has not been at the center of contemporary philosophical discussion. So I want to start by talking about the rise of the concept of representation. And the slogan here is that there was a conceptual sea change from thinking about the relations between appearance and reality in terms of categories of resemblance. There was a sea change to coming to think about the relation between appearance and reality in terms of categories of representation. So the slogan is from resemblance to representation. And the key thing to realize, I think, is that the concept of representation is a distinctively modern concept. Pre-modern, and here I'm thinking of Greek philosophy, theories thought about the relation between appearance and reality in terms of resemblance. And by resemblance, I mean something whose paradigm is the relation between a picture and what it's a picture of. The picturing, we could say, and what is pictured. And to think about that relation in terms of resemblance is to think about it in terms of shared properties. A portrait resembles the one portrayed insofar as it shares with its object some important properties. The shape of the ear, the color of the eyes, and so on. The silhouette of the chin as seen from a certain perspective. And the thought behind the resemblance model is that appearance is veridical insofar as it resembles the reality it's an appearance of, in the sense of sharing properties with it. And insofar as it doesn't resemble the reality, it's misleading, a false appearance, and insofar such error. Plato and Aristotle shared a general resemblance picture of the relation between appearance and reality, though of course they had very different stories about what was shared, about the shared properties, the ideas or the forms. With the rise of modern science, though, this picture became unsustainable. Copernicus discovered that the reality behind the appearance of a stationary Earth and a revolving sun was a stationary sun and a rotating Earth. There wasn't any resemblance there. There were no shared properties. Rest does not resemble motion, and the movement of the sun across the sky didn't resemble the rotation of the Earth or its being at rest. The relation between appearance and reality, already for Copernicus, had to be understood in some much more complicated way for him to sort of make his basic claim that the stationary Earth and the moving sun was an appearance. that he had discovered the underlying reality of the spinning Earth and the stationary sun. But it's really with Galileo that this lesson comes home. He produced a massively effective and productive way of conceiving physical reality geometrically. The book of nature is written in the language of mathematics, he said, and by mathematics he meant geometry. In his geometrical account of the underlying reality, periods of time appear as lengths of a line. That model has become so second nature to us that I think it's hard to appreciate just how radical that is, how little resemblance there is between a period of time between two finger snaps and the length of a line, something that you can see before you in space. But worse, he also represented in his mathematical account of the underlying reality of motion, he represented accelerations of moving bodies, paradigmatically falling bodies, by the areas of triangles. At this point, we've completely left behind any capacity that the notion of resemblance has to inform us about the relation between the underlying, for him, geometrical reality, lengths of lines, areas of triangles, and so on, and the appearance, which was the motion of the bodies. It's almost irresistible for us to think of what he was doing as giving a mathematical model of the way things were. But that was not how Galileo thought about it. He thought of himself as using the language of geometry to describe the reality that our experience of motion was the appearance of. But this was maximally puzzling if all you have to work with is categories of resemblance in thinking about what it is for appearance to be sometimes veridical, sometimes in error, but an appearance of reality, a way reality shows up to us. The notion of shared property that there was between a period of time and the length of a line, the area of a triangle, and the acceleration of an object, this was clearly going to have to be totally rethought if we were going to say, well, there was a shared property or form there. And it was really Descartes who came up with the more abstract meta-concept that Kant would call representation. That was not Descartes' term, but he's the one who gave us a new, more abstract way of thinking about the relation between appearance and reality. I want to say something about how Spinoza had to teach us what Descartes had understood in a way that Descartes had not understood, and then how Kant, looking back at all of this, really straightened it out. But as Spinoza looks back at Descartes, he sees the important model for Descartes' philosophy to be his mathematics, to be his algebraic geometry. Because he discovered how to deploy algebra as a massively productive and effective appearance of what, following Galileo, he still thought of as an essentially geometric reality. Treating something linear in discursive form, like an equation, ax plus by equals c, as the appearance of a geometrical Euclidean line, and an equation like x squared plus y squared equals d as the appearance of a circle allows one to do things, allowed Descartes to do things, like calculate how many points of intersection lines and circles have, and specifically what those points are, and to do a lot more besides. But the sequences of symbols don't at all resemble lines and circles. Still, his mathematical results, which included him algebraically solving a number of geometrical problems that had puzzled people since the Greeks, showed that algebraic symbols do present geometrical facts in a form that's not only potentially and reliably veridical, but makes them conceptually tractable in a new way. And in order to understand philosophically how strings of algebraic symbols could be useful, veridical, tractable appearances of geometrical realities, Descartes needed a new way of thinking about the relation between appearance and reality. And his philosophical response to the scientific and mathematical advances in understanding of his time was the development of a concept of representation that was much more abstract, powerful, and flexible than the resemblance model that it had supplanted. I said, I think the best way to understand Descartes' new conception is not the story he told, though I'll say something more about how he thought about it, but what Spinoza, in his book on Descartes, not first thing he wrote, it's not read enough, I think, what Spinoza made of it, looking at what Descartes did rather than what Descartes said about what he did. Descartes' own talk about representation took over the scholastic idiom of the sun having objective being in our ideas, which were ideas of it, in the sense that the sun had objective being in our ideas. That scholastic idiom was not flexible enough to be helpful to him in saying the things he needed to say. My former Pitt colleague Joe Camp has an article called Descartes, the Last Scholastic, that's wonderful on Descartes sort of struggling with an idiom to express his new insight. But Spinoza focuses on the algebraic geometry and saw more clearly than Descartes himself did that Descartes' real insight is that what made algebraic understanding of geometrical figures possible was a global isomorphism between the whole system of algebraic symbols and the whole system of geometrical figures. This was the driving insight that took the young Spinoza from his Cartesian studies into his mature thinking. The slogan in his mature thinking for this holistic understanding that what was shared was not, as in resemblance models, properties shared by each representing and represented, but rather the overall structure of the whole thing. As Spinoza puts it in the Ethics, the order and connection of things is the same as the order and connection of ideas. That isomorphism global isomorphism defined a notion of form that's shared by the licit manipulations of strings of algebraic symbols and the constructions that are possible on geometric figures. But the crucial thing was you had to think about it globally. In the context of such an isomorphism, the particular material properties of what now become intelligible as representings and representeds, the one-dimensional linear concatenation of algebraic symbols and the two or three-dimensional spatial extendedness of geometrical figures, the particular material properties that the items have becomes irrelevant to the global semantic relation of isomorphism between them that is now, Spinoza sees, Descartes' insight to think of in these more abstract terms of representation. All that matters is the correlation between the rules governing the manipulation of the algebraic representings and the actual possibilities that characterize the geometrical representeds. And so, as Spinoza gave us eyes to see, it was inspired by the newly emerging forms of modern scientific understanding that Descartes concluded that this representational relation, of which resemblance then just shows up as a degenerate special case, a primitive species, that Descartes concludes that this representational relation is the key to understanding the relation between appearance and reality, mind and world, quite generally. Again, modeled on the relation between algebra and geometry. And this was a fabulous tradition-transforming idea. And basically everything Western philosophers have thought since, I think in practical philosophy as well as in theoretical philosophy, is downstream from it conceptually, not just temporally, sort of whether we realize it or not. This is what marked the line between pre-modern and modern philosophy, and we're still trying to figure out what to do with this new conception of representation. Descartes himself didn't, I think, articulate the relation helpfully. I mentioned the scholastic idiom of objective being, the objective being that the sun has in my idea of it, rather than the formal being that the sun has out in the world. Descartes took the world to come in two flavors of things. There were the things that were by nature representings, that were by nature, as he put it, tanquam rem, as if of things. Those were ideas. And there was the rest of the world that was by nature only to be represented. And that he thought of in geometrical, roughly Galilean terms. But in effect, he took the notion of representation as a primitive notion and explored the consequences of it, where his successors in the tradition problematized that relation. They wanted to understand it better than Descartes had understood it. He put it on the table, but he didn't help us in his philosophical musings about it. He didn't help us understand it very much. As I say, it took Spinoza to see sort of what the Cartesian idea was that had led him to this more abstract notion of representation. But Descartes' first thoughts, once he came to think of the world in terms of representations as consisting of representings and what's represented by them, the two substances, his first thought was, if anything is to be known representationally, there must be some things that are known non-representationally, immediately, not by being represented, but just by being there, being grasped. And implicitly, what he saw was, if you don't say that, the notion of knowledge as a representational capacity creates an infinite regress. If representings can only be known representationally, that is, by themselves being represented, then a vicious infinite regress would result. For we'd only know about the represented thing by knowing about a representing of it, and could only count as knowing about that representing of it if we knew about a representing of it, and so on. Now, he concluded that there must be something, some representings, that we knew about non-representationally, more primitively, immediately, in the sense of grasping them in a way that's not mediated by a representing of them. Those are the ideas in our mind, which we know all about simply by having them, non-representationally, and immediately. In a formulation that was only extracted explicitly a couple centuries later by Josiah Royce, if even error, misrepresentation, never mind knowledge, is to be so much as intelligible, then there must be something about which error is not possible. Error is being understood as misrepresenting, as the representing and the represented being out of step. But if even error, misrepresentation, is to be possible, there must be something, some representings, about which error is not possible. There must be some representings that we know about immediately simply by having them. And this, of course, led him to his conception of the mind as what is best known to itself, as transparent and incorrigible. And this is something next week we'll read some of Rorty's principal work, Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature. And this is something that he focuses on as an index of event in the history of the concept of representation. And there was another regress looming that Descartes at least implicitly appreciated. And this concerns not our relation to the representings, but our relation to the relation of representation between representings and representeds. He's putting in place a picture of knowledge that's a representational picture, where the relation between the knowing and what's known is that of a representing to what's represented. And we were talking about the question, I was just talking about the question this raises about our relation to the representings. There must be some non-representational relation we can stand into them. But the same question comes up for our knowledge of and relation to the relation of representation between the representeds and the representings. Again, if we can only know about that representationally by representing it, there's a regress now not on the representings, but on the relations of representation. How do we know about the relation between our representing of the relation of representation as well? This is related to, but I think importantly distinct from the worry that Rorty develops, which is about the threat of skepticism. Rorty's going to say this representational model condemns us to oscillating between skepticism and some kind of foundationalism. But this question about the second form of epistemological skepticism, about the relation, about our knowledge of the relation between representings and representeds, is something that the representational model itself couldn't address, and that Descartes famously had to invoke God in order to guarantee, in effect, the global isomorphism that is what the representational relations consist in, insofar as they can give us models. What Descartes was really worried about here wasn't obvious to him. It took Kant looking back on this to see that though what Descartes officially addressed was epistemological skepticism about our relation to representeds and representings and to the relation between them, can we ever know, and how can we ever know representationally? Once this natural resemblance relation has been broken, once we move to the more abstract one, how can we justify our claims to knowledge? That's the epistemological skepticism. But one of Kant's driving insights was that already in Descartes, the real skeptical threat that he's addressing isn't the epistemological one, it's a semantic skepticism. It's not whether we can actually know anything, and if so, how. It's about the intelligibility of the very notion of knowledge, the intelligibility of the notion of a representational relation between what's known and the knowing of it. This is why modern skepticism is so different from traditional Greek and Stoic skepticism. The difference is made by the abstractness of the representation relation, the distance it puts us at from the object of knowledge. And it raises what, this only becomes explicit with Kant, but what we can see is the threat of semantic skepticism, of it becoming, the threat is that it's not even intelligible that we should know things representationally. And yet, that's what the new scientific knowledge, that was the only way to understand that, was in these representational terms. So all that's a story about how it could be that this new conception of representation comes to sit at the center of early modern philosophy. And it's in terms of that conception as well that we should understand the philosophers downstream from Descartes in the period before Kant really sort of understands all this. The opposition between that Kant made canonical between rationalist successors of Descartes and empiricist philosophers of Descartes. So Kant's take on what happens after Descartes crucially depends on what Kant now makes explicit as the notion of representation, and says Descartes was right to think of the mind exclusively in terms of representation. But his concept of pensée runs together two fundamentally different kinds of representation. Roughly, picture-like images or sensations and sentence-like thoughts. Descartes runs them together because he has this genus. Well, they're both representationally contentful, and the regress argument leads him to think that these both must be kinds of representations that we're immediately related to, that is, non-representationally related to, that we can grasp them, be aware of them just by having them, that they don't need to be represented in order to be known. And Rorty, in his own development, starts off puzzling about this. This is in his classic article, Incorrigibility as the Mark of the Mental. He's puzzling about why the mind-body problem isn't ancient, about how Descartes could assimilate things which in the Aristotelian and scholastic tradition were so different. The sensations which non-rational animals already had, the feeling of pain, the way red things look. The Aristotelian and scholastic tradition saw those as characteristic of a much lower grade of being than the rational beings who could have thoughts. So it was an innovation of Descartes to assimilate these under this new conception of representation. And Kant thinks that was an advance, to see that there was, to see that we should think of both of them in representational terms, to think of both what for Kant are intuitions and concepts as representations, as species of representations. That was a pure advance as far as Kant is concerned. But his predecessors, Kant's predecessors, didn't understand how different they are, that these were two fundamentally different species of representation that played quite distinct functional roles in our capacity to know something. Their success, the figures between Descartes and Kant assimilated these along a single dimension and thought of empiricists treating thoughts as fancy, abstract sensations, and the rationalists treating sensations as confused, indistinct thoughts. And from Kant's point of view, this is as though you failed to see that cats and dogs were different species and thought there was one kind of animal that you could array along a dimension with the more cat-like at one end and the more dog-like at the other end. One can admire the ingenuity of the rationalists and empiricists in trying to understand the one kind of representing in terms that take the other as the paradigm and the model, but Kant says that's completely wrong. And yet, he thinks it's crucial that these are species of the genus representation, Vorstellung, which he introduces that term specifically for that purpose. So Kant certainly understands the opposition between empiricists and rationalists in terms of this master concept, Enlightenment master concept of representation. Now, I've already mentioned Spinoza's insight, his way of understanding what was distinctive about Descartes' understanding of representation. That actually underwrites a different way of thinking about the relation between rationalists and empiricists. Because the empiricists are relentlessly atomistic in their thinking about representation. They're still thinking about representation item by item. They never learned the holistic lesson about what distinguished the representational model from the resemblance model. They were reactionary in still trying to twist the resemblance notion, trying to stretch it in a way to cover the representations of modern science. Whereas Spinoza himself, the order and connection of things is the same as the order and connection of ideas. Spinozism was holism. That was the first way in which these holistic representational ideas come into public, come out in view. His slogan, Hen Kai Pan, one as everything, that would be so important for the German idealists. This is a holistic notion. And the holism is striking in Leibniz, whose notion of degrees of perception and the infinite mirroring of monads is essentially holistic, in that any difference in the perceptions of any monad has to be a difference in the perceptions of every monad, even if at an indistinct degree. So Leibniz is also trying to think through this holistic conception that he sees as part and parcel of the new notion of representation. And I may be giving a misimpression in sort of slighting Leibniz in the story in this breathless story of the history of the concept of representation, because this was sort of at the center of everything he was thinking about, and he explicitly took mathematical models to try and understand this holism. But a second way, besides Kant's way of thinking about the division between empiricists and rationalists in early modern philosophy, is that the empiricists were atomists and the rationalists were holists about representation. And we'll see that continues into the 20th century, where figures like Carnap and essentially of our own time, Jerry Fodor, insists on an atomistic understanding of representations, of, as he puts it, the relation between horses and horses. We have to be able to understand that in terms of those items and their relations, independently of the relation of horses to any other representings, or of horses to any other represented things. If Spinoza and Leibniz were right, that's a hopeless enterprise. That's missing a fundamental aspect of this revolutionary new notion. And spoiler alert, they are right. Unless you think of this in holistic terms, you're never going to understand representation. So that's two ways of thinking about rationalists and empiricists in terms of representation. Kant's way, there's two fundamentally different kinds of representation, and the rationalists took the sensations as paradigmatic and tried to understand thoughts in terms of them, and the rationalists went the other way around. And there's this divide between atomism and holism in thinking about representation. I mean, a question I won't address, but you might think about sometime is, did things have to line up this way? Is it just a coincidence that those two ways of dividing the labor and the approach line up as they do? Is there something about sensations that, if you take them to be the paradigmatic thing, tempts you to an atomism, so that an empiricist is going to, whereas if you start with thoughts, and what's a reason for what. Holism is readier to hand. A third way of thinking about this distinction is the one I develop in early chapters of Making It Explicit, which looks at the order of explanation and sees the empiricists as following Descartes in taking the representational character of ideas for granted, taking representation as a primitive, the idea that the thought that ideas present themselves as if of things, taking that as primitive, the thing that Kant is going to claim we need to understand, and seeking to understand the goodness of inferences and what's a reason for what in terms of that notion of primitive representational content. So they have an order of explanation that goes from representation, treated as primitive, to inference and reasoning. And the rationalists, Spinoza and Leibniz, start with a notion of what's a reason for what, as articulating the contents of thoughts. And each in his own way tries to understand representation in terms of that. Now, this is something I've written about how Spinoza and Leibniz did that. But one of Leibniz's characteristic moves was to understand the sense in which a map is a representation of the terrain, in a sense more abstract than a picture of it in terms of reason relations. So he says the key thing is that to understand something as a map, to take or treat it in practice as a representing, is precisely to be able to make inferences from map facts to terrain facts. So your mastery of the map as a representation is a matter of your being able to infer from the fact that there's a wavy blue line between these two dots, a map fact, to infer that if you go from Pittsburgh to Columbus, you have to cross a river. Treating it as a representation is being able to make inferences like that, from map facts to terrain facts, from facts about the representings to facts about the representeds. That's epitomizes the way he thinks we can go from reason relations to representational relations. At any rate, a third way of understanding the split between rationalists and empiricists in terms of the concept of representation is the order of explanation. Whether you take representation as primitive and try and understand reasoning in terms of it, or as Spinoza and as Leibniz clearly did, and I argue Spinoza does, taking inferential relations, reason relations as primitive and understanding representational relations in terms of them. Representation is important for both of them, but it comes up in a different part, it plays a different role in the order of explanation that they're doing. A fourth way of thinking about the relation between empiricists and rationalists in terms of representation is due to Sellers. And this is something I think even some of Sellers' students, people who've read a lot of him, don't appreciate this, I think, characteristically insightful and original way of distinguishing two camps of philosophers. Originally, the Enlightenment empiricists and rationalists, but Sellers thinks these two camps do not go away, that you find them in contemporary in contemporary philosophy as well. Again, in terms of their attitude towards representation, his preferred way of putting the point is in terms of the model of description. A bit later on, I'll say something about the relation between representation and description, but for this point, the differences don't matter. And crucially, for the theme of this course, he makes the distinction in terms of an ideology that he takes empiricists and rationalists to share. He calls that descriptivism, and it is the representationalism that we're after. The idea is that to be conceptually or cognitively contentful just is to describe or represent how things are. That's the descriptivist, representationalist core idea. And here's what Sellers does with it diagnostically. He says, empiricists start with a narrowly circumscribed a priori notion of what representing or describing is, and exclude and condemn a lot of genuinely conceptually and cognitively contentful activity for not fitting that standard, for being defective because it doesn't consist in describing or saying how things are, representing how things are. And the result is expressivism in ethics, skepticism about modality of the Hume-Quine sort, what Sellers calls nothing but-ism in all of its varieties. So the empiricists take this descriptivist model and use it in a Procrustean way and say, look, the significant thing to do is to be describing the world or representing how the world is, and anything else you do isn't cognitively significant. It's some second-class activity. Rationalists accept the same underlying picture. They accept the representationalist descriptivist ideology, but they embrace all sorts of other activities as cognitively significant, since their paradigm, after all, is reasoning, inferring, which is not evidently representing or describing. But what they do is look for what's represented or described by all of these other cognitively significant activities. And the result is ontological extravagance. They postulate objective values, universals, propositions, laws. Sellers is going to claim that they're making a common mistake, the descriptivist mistake, and that what we should do is reject that. But my current point is, Sellers understands the empiricists and the rationalists. In his writings, the rationalist is often, in the dialogues, is often given the name metaphysicus, the metaphysician, the one who is still a descriptivist, but makes up something to be described by all the things that are not evidently descriptive or representational. Whereas the empiricist excludes or denigrates in some way everything that isn't describing or representing the way the world is. So that he sees as the common mistake of them. But again, the division is driven by their treatment of this notion of representation. And Sellers crucially saw the philosophical significance of the Tractatus, which I'll come back to in a minute, as teaching us how to get beyond that descriptivist representationalist ideology, at least for logical vocabulary. But for Sellers, that was the thin leading edge of a wedge that Wittgenstein could see another significant function besides representing how things are that vocabulary could play. Logical vocabulary does not picture facts. And Sellers thought that was an insight in what otherwise is the Bible of representationalism, the Tractatus, but it points beyond it. Okay, so I talked about 4 ways of thinking about empiricists and rationalists in terms of representation. Kant's way, they don't realize they're right, that everything is representations, but they don't realize there's these 2 fundamentally different species, and so they try and model one on one kind on the other. The order of explanation, do you start with primitive representation and understand reasoning in terms of it, or go the other way around? The holist versus atomist picture, and this Salarzian picture. Do you follow out your representationalist commitment to understanding everything that we're doing cognitively as describing or representing the way the world is, by starting with a strict notion of what doing that is and excluding or denigrating everything else? Or do you start with a capacious sense of what our cognitive activity is and then try and find representational understandings of doing that, of reasoning, for instance, as perceiving rational connections between things? So all of this is in aid of saying that this deeply original move that Descartes makes, introducing the notion of representation, it really did pervade Enlightenment epistemology, philosophy of mind, down through the period when Kant retrospectively codified it and said, look, this is what it's been about all along, as the others didn't. Next thing, I'd just like to rehearse 3 lessons about representation that, looking back through Kant's eyes, we ought to learn from already the pre-Kantian discussion of it. And the first consequence I've already extracted, that's that representation is an essentially holistic conception. Spinoza and Leibniz were just right about this, I'm going to claim. And certainly Kant thought so. Second, representation and description essentially involve subjunctively robust relations between representings and representeds, relations that are properly specified in alethic modal terms. I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. This is significant if you turn the crank one more time. If you're an empiricist, that's a dangerous thought, that representation is already a modally robust notion, because that means it's not a purely descriptive notion for an empiricist. And the third lesson that's going to resonate, starting with Kant and after, is that representation has an essentially normative dimension. Now, I've said, I've at least gestured at the holist point. This plays a significant role in Kant's understanding of concepts and of judgment. It's really what the transcendental unity of apperception is, a holistic unity. But Hegel is really the first one to build that holist insight into the ground floor of his philosophical idiom, the first one to try and think through the logic of conceptual content construed holistically. The second point, the essentially modal character of representational relations, shows up already in Leibniz. If you think about that map analysis in terms of inference that I gave, if you think about the representational character of the map in terms of the goodness of inferences from map facts to terrain facts, that's the difference between the map fact that this square dot is twice the size of this round dot, and you can infer something about the populations or maybe the area of the cities, from a fact about the map that's not a map fact. There's this circle on it from where I put my coffee cup down. And that's a fact about the map, that there's this brown circle on it. But it's not a map fact in that you can't infer anything about the terrain from that. The size of the margins of the map are not map facts, even though they're facts about it. But it's crucial, and Leibniz already worried about this, that those inferences are lawful or subjunctively robust. In taking it to be a map, you're taking that if the terrain were different, the map would be different. That's the subjunctive relation. This is the basis for Fodor's account of representation in terms of his slogan is one-way counterfactual dependences of horses, the representings, on horses. That if horses were different, we would use horses differently. That's the one-way counterfactual dependence. And this point about the subjunctive robustness of the relations between representings and representeds comes out in a striking way in the Tractatus, which otherwise is not a work that is thinking about modality. But the picturing of object facts by name facts requires, Wittgenstein in the Tractatus says, a method of projection. And it turns out that projection in this sense includes at least the requirement that if the facts were or had been different, the representings would be or would have been different in systematic ways. Those projection facts that link the representing facts to the represented facts in the Tractatus, as modally robust, this method of projection, are not themselves picturable in the sense of the Tractatus. So by Tractarian standards, they're ineffable. They can't be said. The projection method can only be shown precisely because of its subjunctive robustness. You're doing more than merely describing the two sets of facts. You're using the picturing facts as pictures in this more abstract representational sense in a way that depends on the subjunctive robustness, which is not itself an arrangement of objects, and so a describable, representable fact in the Tractatus. So I said there's a holistic lesson to learn, there's a modal lesson to learn. There's There's a lesson to learn about the holistic character of representation. There's a lesson to learn about the modal character of representation, the relation between representings and representeds. And as to the third, this was really Kant who discovered it. Remember, Kant was not only the philosopher of representations, he was also the philosopher of rules. And indeed, one's understanding of Kant largely consists in how you understand the relation between those two master concepts in Kant. What is the relation between the notion of representation and the notion of rules? For Kant, those are two sides of one coin. But why is that, and how does that work exactly? From Kant's point of view, well, Spinoza was entirely right to see that it was of the essence of the representational relation between them that the order and connection of things is the same as the order and connection of ideas. What Spinoza didn't see is that the order and connection of ideas is essentially a normative order, that committing yourself to one claim obliges you to acknowledge commitment to another, entitles you to another set of commitments. That the relations among ideas are relations of obligation and permission, are normative relations. That is something that's expressed by rules as rules apply to representings. The way he talks about rules is in terms of necessity. Necessity, Notwendigkeit, he says, means of or pertaining to rules. And necessity is for him essentially a genus that has two species, the natural and the practical, expressed by a lethic modal vocabulary, rules in the form of laws of nature, which articulate the order and connection of things, and rules in the form of rules of thought, norms governing thought, which is practical necessity. So for Kant, acknowledging the rulishness of representations, of the representational relation, is absolutely essential. Hegel sees that point as the axis around which all of Kant's thought revolves. He thought that Kant saw that the representational relation is essentially a normative relation. Now, I'd like to bracket whether he's right about Kant or sort of how explicit this is in Kant. But what Hegel makes of Kant is the idea that to say that one thing is a representing of something represented is to say that the represented thing exercises a certain kind of authority over the representing of it. It serves, namely, as a standard of normative assessment of the correctness of the representing as a representing of what's represented, just in virtue of the represented thing serving as that normative standard of assessment of correctness. That is, for some, just saying the same thing in other words, to be a representing is to be responsible to something that counts as represented by the representing, just in virtue of exercising that kind of authority, the represented thing serving as a standard of normative assessment of the correctness of the representing as a representing of that represented thing. And this idea is at the center of one of Rorty's three great anti-representationalist arguments that I will claim he went through sequentially. It's not at the center of his argument in Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature, but it is at the center of his pragmatism. argument. Because Rorty is going to say, Rorty, my pragmatism is in the first instance a pragmatism about norms. That to talk about norms is always to talk about the role something plays in social practices. That apart from our social practices, there is no authority or responsibility. This is pragmatism. And if you hold that sort of pragmatism, that all normative relations are ultimately relations, a matter of functional roles in social practices, and you understand representational relations normatively in terms of the authority of representeds over representings, the responsibility of representings to representeds, then you say that representational relations are matters of social practice. And that's the Rortyian claim that takes us off to the pragmatist races. I mean, we're going to look at that line of thought a great deal in coming weeks, but it starts with this Kantian insight that there's an essentially normative dimension to representational relations. That's what's going to give Rorty's pragmatism a grip on the concept of representation. Okay, well, that's the big hand-wavy first time through story about the concept of representation, barely peeked into the 20th century with a reference to the Tractatus there. I think it is striking that we don't have a definitive treatment of the history of the concept of representation. This is something I would think should be a genre that had competing stories about, and it has not attracted much interest under those under that specification. Anything anybody wants to say about that big hand-wavy story?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Okay, so when you were giving the story about the empiricists and the as atomists and the rationalists, and you mentioned Carnap and Fodor, you said that you think that Leibniz and Spinoza were right in terms of their holistic picture. And until you really have that picture, you won't understand representation. And I'm just curious what you meant, like what kind of notion of understanding you're using here. If you could say something about that.
That is, what are the criteria of adequacy for understanding representation?
Right. Especially when you say that this is the only way that you can understand representation rather than, buying into that empiricist atomistic picture.
Yeah, okay, good. I mean, one of the things we'll do is assemble criteria of adequacy. I think one needs to look at the tradition of anti-representationalists, the ones who say, look, this whole notion of understanding the relation of appearance and reality, or mind and world in representational terms, is broken backed because, and then we get a variety of objections to it. And I take it that there's enough to those objections that an adequate understanding of representation has got to respond to those. It has got to make sense of the modal aspect of representation, of the normative aspect of representation, has got to have something to say about how representation is different from resemblance as a model. So I think one of the things we want from the anti-representationalists is precisely a set of criteria of adequacy for making proper sense of the notion of representation. You can see already in Descartes, his regress arguments set criteria of adequacy. Is it the case that if you understand knowledge and error in representational terms, then there has to be some kind of knowledge that's non-representational? That's a criterion of adequacy. I can't give you a list, but that's where we're going. Okay. So I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about representationalism. As you can tell from the title of the course, I think there's two principal strands of anti-representationalist thought. Pragmatism, as Rorty construes it, and expressivism. Expressivism itself has got two quite different schools of thought, two quite different origins. One is the German expressivism that begins with Herder and was the origin of romantic anti-representationalism, romanticism as understanding the Enlightenment as having been representationalist. Herder's expressivism gave another model for thinking about cognitive contentfulness, an expressivist model. It was a kind of global anti-representationalism. It said, don't think in terms of representation at all, think instead in terms of expression. And then the other expressivist tradition is 20th century metaethical expressivism, which said, look, there are some vocabularies for which the representational model is not the proper model. And the reason our readings culminate in Hugh Price is that he synthesizes those two expressivist traditions with each other, sees them as pushing one basic line and having sort of specific differences among them. So he unifies those and then synthesizes expressivism with Rortian pragmatism. So brings all the strands of anti-representationalism together. So that's where we're going. But in something like the previous academic generation, Rorty has been the most prominent anti-representationalist, and it's been his pragmatism that he understands as a globally anti-representationalist creed. Cheryl Misak, who is the most important contemporary philosophical scholar of pragmatism, strongly contests this characterization and appropriation of the pragmatist tradition. And so we're going to look at what she has to say. She, interestingly, thinks that the proper heir of that pragmatist tradition is Hugh Price. And Hugh Price thinks he's a Rortian. So there's some complicated toing and froing here. Simon Blackburn, we'll read, is one of the most articulate and sophisticated contemporary exponents of the sort of local expressivism that opens up another route to a distinctive kind of anti-representationalism. And I'll just mention that Hugh Price is just retiring as the Bertrand Russell Professor of Philosophy at Trinity College, Cambridge. he is the successor of Simon Blackburn in that chair. And one of the things that Cheryl Misak has done for our understanding of pragmatism is to synthesize classical American pragmatism with what she calls Cambridge pragmatism, whose principal avatar is Frank Jackson, Frank Ramsey. You've probably seen her big book on Ramsey is just out, but she wrote an earlier book called Cambridge Pragmatism, in which Ramsey and the later Wittgenstein are principal avatars of pragmatism. And that's the tradition she sees Hugh Price properly as the contemporary avatar of. But a good place to start in thinking about the different forms of anti-representationalist arguments is with Rorty. And he makes a series of ever more incendiary claims. And the first one is that it's not just that representation was a crucially important and central concept in the Enlightenment, but that there was an ideology associated with it, what he calls representationalism. It's a kind of semantic ideology. It's roughly the idea that the meaningfulness or contentfulness of thought and talk should be understood principally or even exclusively in terms of representational relations that thinkings and sayings stand in to what they at least purport to represent. That is, that language and thought are, at base, the description or representation of how things are. And Rorty claims that that ideology defined central philosophical disciplines, epistemology, philosophy of mind, and later philosophy of language. And further, that that was not just an Enlightenment feature, that that ideology continues to define the central core areas of philosophy right down through contemporary analytic philosophy. And he claims that that ideology of representationalism essentially involves various fundamental philosophical pathologies. And that those pathologies are so crippling that the only appropriate response, once we have seen clear about these bad ideas, is to reject this toxic ideology, holus bolus, completely. And not content at that point, he even more radically claims that the weed that is this pathological ideology has become so intertwined with the concept of representation that there's no longer any reasonable prospect of separating them. You can't prune the weed and leave a healthy plant. So he thinks the concept of representation has been rendered useless for philosophical purposes by this ideology of representationalism. So the concept of representation needs to be given up. It had its day, did its work, it was important when Descartes introduced it, but the very idea of us as mirrors of nature, as in the phrase that he gives its title to his book, has had its day and outlived its usefulness. It shouldn't be reformed or restricted, but just jettisoned. And his constructive alternative is pragmatism, which is simply not going to be concerned with representational relations between us and the world, but having a more ecological picture of how our discursive practices help us cope with things in the world. But not content with offering an alternative, a pragmatist alternative to thinking in terms of representation, he thinks that the concept of representation in its representationalist form, it has defined philosophy in its modern period, brought to one peak of perfection by Kant and to another by the Tractatus, and that philosophy today can be understood as doing the kind of thing that Kant did. And we can't do that anymore, he thinks, because that's essentially a representationalist project. So whatever we do, it can't be philosophy as we've known it for the last 300 years. It has to be something else. So he says, what we do as we continue to read the classical philosophers, it won't be philosophy anymore. He's the prophet of the death of philosophy. Well, this just made his colleagues go essentially berserk. He was once asked, a decade later, how he felt about having been excommunicated from analytic philosophy. And he characteristically shrugged and said, "Oh, wasn't aware it was a church." But behind that insouciance was a genuine phenomenon where he really was sort of read out of the lists of respectable philosophers. And I think as a result, more attention was paid to sort of the inflammatory consequences that he drew from the opposition between his pragmatism and representationalism than was ever devoted to his actual complaints about where we go wrong when we use the notion of representation. So that's what I propose we focus on. But I've talked about these two particular anti-representationalist traditions, the pragmatism as Rorty understands it, and expressivism, sort of as the two strands of expressivism are synthesized by Price, preparatory to synthesizing them with Rortyian pragmatism. But actually there are sort of larger movements of thought that these correspond to and epitomize. And one way of thinking about them is to think about the relation between the early Wittgenstein and the later Wittgenstein, the Tractatus and the philosophical investigations. I once taught an undergraduate course in Wittgenstein, and in the course description started, Ludwig Wittgenstein was the two greatest philosophers of the 20th century. And the registrar sent this back to me saying, "Oh, there's something incoherent. You've made a mistake here." And I sent it back, "No, this is exactly what I meant." The Tractatus is something like the Bible of representationalism, as well as providing the crucial step for moving beyond it. And the investigations plays a corresponding role for anti-representationalism. Rorty is eager to appropriate the later Wittgenstein for his version of pragmatism as anti-representationalism. And even his sternest critic, Misak, who I focus on because she's not one of the ones, she came into the story after, Rorty and his critics had had their day. She was not one of the people who attacked him and so on. She really worried about, well, is this pragmatism as he says, and so on. We'll see, she's a serious, engaged philosophical critic. And she agrees with his classification of Wittgenstein as a paradigmatic pragmatist. And we'll be interested in the anti-representationalism downstream from Wittgenstein. I should say parenthetically, the one Rorty pairs with the later Wittgenstein as a pragmatist in the same sense as his hero Dewey is the early Heidegger, the Heidegger of being and time. And Misak does not think that makes any sense at all. That's evidence of Rorty having cycled out of bounds in his reading of pragmatism for her. And Wittgenstein's two books stand out as canonical expressions of two broadly opposed traditions of philosophical thinking about language in the 20th century, a logistical tradition and an anthropological tradition. So the logistical tradition is the one that runs from Frege and Russell through the Tractatus, Carnap, Tarski, Quine, to Kripke and David Lewis. And its operative paradigm is the sort of formal calculi that are suitable for codifying mathematical proofs in artificial symbolic languages. And you can think of traditional analytic philosophy on both sides of the Atlantic as a development of this stream of thought, one way or another. Tarskian model theory as a paradigm of semantics, as interpreted and eulogized by Quine, and then its more powerful successor, possible world semantics, is widely and I think correctly regarded as the most perfect development and distillation of the idea of understanding meaning or content in terms of representation. And that's one of the reasons that we ought to worry about anti-representationalist arguments. If there's any go to them, there's an important lesson to be learned. By contrast, the anthropological tradition focuses on natural languages rather than artificial ones, and thinks of them as a kind of social practice central to and characteristic of the natural history of biological creatures like us. The classical American pragmatists, culminating in Dewey, are exponents of this tradition, which includes not just the Wittgenstein of the investigations, but the early Heidegger too. And I should say, so Misak is horrified by trying to include early Heidegger as a pragmatist. The only people who are more horrified are the Heideggerians. Heidegger himself rejected being in time as a merely anthropological juvenile work. Essentially, all Heideggerians are outraged at the thought that he might be, in any sense, a pragmatist. The honorable and interesting exception is Bart Dreyfus and his students, who are, for my money, the most interesting readers of Heidegger. But in this anthropological tradition, the emphasis isn't on the meaning or content of linguistic expressions thought of in terms of what they represent, but on their use, on the functional roles that discursive practices play in the lived lives of practitioners. And I think, if we just think in the sort of broad terms that I'm invoking these two traditions in, it's interesting that they're by no means confined to philosophy. So for instance, we find corresponding traditions in psychology. The contemporary correlate of the representationalist tradition is the rise of cognitive science, whose founding faith and origin story in the late 70s and early 80s defined it by its methodological rejection of behaviorism in favor of postulating internal representations. That was thought of as the essence of the cognitive science revolution, was they were going to work in terms of internal representations. And the opposing tradition runs from James J. Gibson's reconceptualization of perception in terms of behavioral affordances through to contemporary embedded, embodied, ecological, and enactivist approaches to perception. So one of the things I want to do in the course is get clearer about what's at stake between these large movements of thought, which divide in no small part over the treatment of representation and representationalism. Now, a couple of conceptual distinctions are in order here. When I introduced Sellers' take on the Enlightenment divide between empiricists and rationalists, I mentioned that one of his great foes is what he called descriptivism, by which he meant the tendency to assimilate all discourse to describing. And this is clearly a form of representationalism. He says descriptivism, the tendency to assimilate all discourse to describing, is responsible for the prevalence, especially in the empiricist tradition, of nothing butism in all its various forms: emotivism, behaviorism, and phenomenalism being examples of that. So the emotivist says, claims about what you ought to do are not saying anything about how the world is. They're expressing something. They're doing something different. Behaviorism says what we should be doing is describing the behavior, not looking upstream to internal representations that you're manipulating and acting. Phenomenalism says physical objects are nothing but logical constructions out of sensory experiences. Here we think of Carnap's Aufbau. Sellers says there's one ideology behind these, that's descriptivism. I mean, he thinks descriptivism is behind the extravagance of metaphysicus, the rationalist, as well, as we've seen. So clearly, you could think, and Sellers did, that describing how things are, or a phrase Sellers takes to be equivalent to that, using fact-stating discourse, is one crucially important, even central and essential use of language, without further assimilating all uses to that kind and dismissing other uses as defective. If you make that second move, you say, look, it's not just that describing or representing how things are, stating facts, is the central use of language, but everything else is second-class use. Parasitic, derivative, only to be understood in terms of the first one. At that point, you've made an ideological move, Rorty is going to say. That's the step that is the representationalist, descriptivist, ideological step. So here are characteristic statements of Sellers. I put these on your footnote. Once the tautology, the world is described by descriptive concepts, is freed from the idea that the business of all non-logical concepts is to describe. You only say non-logical after the Tractatus. Logical atomism of Russell's type and of Wittgenstein's type in the early teens of the 20th century treated, looked for negative facts and conditional facts, negative existential facts too. But after the Tractatus, he thinks even empiricists have learned to say non-logical concepts. freed from the idea that the business of all non-logical concepts is to describe, the way is clear to an ungrudging recognition that many expressions which empiricists have relegated to second-class citizenship in discourse are not inferior, they're just different. Okay, so that would be to reject the ideology of representationalism. If you free it from the idea that the central function of language. And then again, the idea that the world can, in principle, be so described that the description contains no modal expressions is of a piece with the idea that the world can, in principle, be described, so described that the description contains no prescriptive expressions. And again, for not all knowing is knowing how to describe something. We know what we ought to do as well as what the circumstances are. So if you think about this descriptivist form of anti-representationalism, it's clear that one prominent way of resisting that ideology is an expressivism that insists that some vocabulary, some locutions, paradigmatically normative, maybe paradigmatically moral normative locutions, aren't second class, but play a non-descriptive role, an expressive role. So in a sort of survey article, Dorit Bar-On characterizes the underlying expressivist view this way. She says, expressivism designates a family of philosophical views. Very roughly, these views maintain that claims in the relevant area of discourse are in the business of giving expression to sentiments, commitments, or other non-cognitive or at least non-representational mental states or attitudes, rather than describing or reporting a range of facts. And the paradigm is metaethical expressivism, prominent in the 20th century, A.J. Ayer and C.L. Stevenson. And here I want to say that the metaethical expressivists, and one of the reasons Blackburn is interesting is that he follows Hume, anyway, his interesting reading of Hume, in extending the expressivism beyond the metaethical. He says he sees Hume as, and he follows him in being an expressivist about the three M's: moral discourse, modal discourse, and mathematical discourse, including talk of abstracta and universals. Nonetheless, it's important to Sellers, it's important to Blackburn that while they are against global descriptivism, against global representationalism, they're not global anti-representationalists. They're only local anti-representationalists. That is, they're happy to use descriptive and representational locutions to talk about some of our discursive practices, the use of ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary to say that the frog is on the log. They say, well, yes, you are representing the frog as being on the log. You're describing him as being on the log. You are stating the fact that the frog is on the log. It's just that there are important, essential things that we do with language that aren't doing that aren't representing, describing, stating facts, and so on. Rortian anti-representationalism is global anti-representationalism. He's saying you shouldn't even think about the frog is on the log as a description or a representation. I mean, he's happy to use the word description, but don't think of it in representational terms. It's a mode of coping. And Hugh Price is a global anti-representationalist. He's going to claim that it's never appropriate to use representational locutions in understanding the relation, in understanding sort of what we're doing in talking and thinking. In this regard, Rortian and Pricean pragmatism belongs in a box with the German expressivism that had a global alternative. Saw expressivism as a global alternative to Enlightenment representationalism. And it's Price's remarkable achievement to have brought all these things together. Now, we should be cautious about running descriptivism together with representationalism. The concept of representation is wider than the concept of description. I think all describing is representing how things are, but not all representing is by describing. In particular, using demonstratives, using indexicals, using proper names are not in any philosophically ordinary sense of the term descriptive expressions. You're not describing things when you use demonstratives, when you use indexicals, when you use a proper name. This is something we've been particularly sensitized to by Kripke in Naming and Necessity. Sellers was incautious about this. He was not careful about it and thought of all these things as part of the descriptive resources of the language in the broad sense he was using them. I think we can use global descriptivism as long as we keep in mind that the representationalism that is at issue involves representational resources that are not strictly descriptive, including these demonstrative, indexical, and proper names. Maybe natural kind terms are like that, non-descriptive. There's another, so strictly speaking, descriptivism is narrower than representationalism, but if we're careful, we can use those together. There's another view in the vicinity that's important, though, to distinguish from representationalism of the sort that's the target of the various anti-representationalists, and that's declarativism. And this is the view that all declarative sentences ought to be understood to be in the business of fact stating, of saying how things are, of representing the way things are. And so that all uses of declarative sentences can be assimilated to the use of ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary to say things like, the frog is on the log. And I think a good way into declarativism is Geach's masterful gem-like essay, Ascriptivism. His target there is metaethical expressivism, theories that understand the normative significance of terms such as good as not part of the content of what's said, not part of how you're describing somebody when you say, oh, what he did was good, or he ought to have done that, not as specifying a characteristic that's being attributed, but rather as marking the force of the speech act in Frege's sense. What you're doing when you say something, what you're doing on this form of ascriptivism that's his target is commending or expressing your approval of something when you say it's good or it's what you ought to do. And in this essay, he asks, well, what are the limits of this ploy? I mean, could I say that when I call something a frog, I'm not really describing it or representing it as a frog, I'm performing some distinctive froggy speech act. And he finds this lovely old, archaic English word, macarize. To macarize someone is to characterize them as happy. And he says, now, you would have thought that when you say John is happy, you've described him. You've ascribed a property to him. You've described him in a particular way as being happy. But suppose my theory is you haven't. You've performed a different speech act. You've Macarized him rather than describing him in any way. He says, what are the limits of this speech act? If we could do it with happy, we could do it with having a mass greater than 50 grams or red. What are the rules of the game? And he suggests that there is a test for whether something is expressing force or is modifying the descriptive content. And that's whether you can embed it in a more complex sentence paradigmatically as the antecedent of a conditional. So for instance, the force of an imperative, when I say shut the door, that force really is not part of the content. I'm not describing the door as having any particular property. I'm doing something else, taking up another stance towards it. And you can see that because you can't say, if shut the door, then such and such. But he says you can say, if that's the right thing to do, if that's a good thing to do, if that's what you ought to do, then by all means do it. That is, normative vocabulary embeds perfectly well as the antecedent of a conditional. But notice that embedding as the antecedent of a conditional strips the pragmatic force off of something. When I say, if the moon is made of green cheese, then there must be space cows, I have not asserted that the moon is made of green cheese. I asserted the conditional, but the assertional force of that declarative sentence was stripped off because it was embedded. That's why you can't embed imperatives. But you can embed normative vocabulary. And you, in the same way that you can embed, if John is happy, then I'm glad for him. Well, that shows that Geach says that in saying John is happy, I haven't performed some other speech act macarizing him, because in saying if John is happy, then I'm glad for him, I haven't macarized anybody. It was only inside the conditional. It shows that there is some descriptive content. I am describing him in some way because it embeds. And he points out that all these declarative sentences, they're truth apt. It's sensible to ask, is it true that you ought to do that? And if they're embeddable, he says, that's good enough to say that they're fact stating, that they're describing how things are. That's declarativism. And declarativism is a way to have descriptivism or representationalism on the cheap. You get an eminently defensible version of global representationalism. Declarative sentences, yeah, they are absolutely the core of talking, but only at the cost of making it platitudinous. None of Rorty, Sellers, and Price want to deny that when they're denying representationalism, they don't want to deny that these are perfectly good declarative sentences that we're using. The best way to think about declarativism and Geach's argument, I think, is that he's setting a declarative criterion of adequacy for anti-descriptivists or anti-representationalists. He's saying, look, if you're going to be, say, an expressivist about ethical terminology, normative vocabulary, you're going to have to explain why we can use these as declarative sentences that are truth evaluable and embed them the same way we can embed any other declarative sentences as antecedents of conditionals. And this argument of Geach's, what's come to be known as the Frege-Geach argument, because he attributes it to Frege. I said this Descriptivism article, I described it as gem-like. It's 5 pages long. He sort of makes this argument and gets out. And it was hugely influential. It marked the divide between old-timey metaethical expressivism and second-wave expressivism, which is distinguished by people like Blackburn, like Alan Gibbard, are distinguished as second-wave expressivists precisely by taking the declarativist challenge seriously, specifically that their expressivism explicitly acknowledges the obligation to make sense of embedded occurrences of the kinds of locutions that they're expressivists about. But declarativism, as I say, is representationalism on the cheap, because what Rorty objects to is taking what a model of fact stating, a representational model, a descriptive model that may be helpful for the frog is on the log, and thinking that that's also the right semantic paradigm for understanding sentences like triangularity is a property, or patience is a virtue, or laws of nature are exceptionless, or freedom is better than slavery. Now, those are all declarative sentences that are apt for truth evaluation. We can ask whether they're true, which is really a way of saying you can be committed to them, you can assert them, and so on. But the question they want to ask comes after that. Should we understand them as describing ways the world can be, as representing states of affairs, as purporting to state facts in the same sense in which the frog is on the log does? And they claim, no, we should understand them completely differently. The Salarzian rationalist, metaphysicus, is a declarativist, but is a representationalist about everything you can put in a declarative sentence. And so bites the bullet and says, yes, there are logical facts, negative facts, they're conditional facts, they're negative existential facts. That's the commitment. Wittgenstein was able to write the Tractatus when he saw how to get out from under that. But you're committed then to modal facts about what's necessary and what's possible, probabilistic facts, semantic facts about representation, meaning, and truth, intentional facts about possibly non-existent objects of thought, the Golden Mountain, and so on, normative facts about how things ought to be, that you're describing the world as containing, abstract facts about universals, propositions, mathematical objects like sets and categories. And from Rorty's point of view, thinking about how you're representing the world as being when you use these other vocabularies is an ontological extravagance that's bound to create more puzzles than it can clear up. And the declarativist seems, the declarativist sense of representation, either you can have a very deflationary sense reading of it, which is okay for Rorty or for Price, or you can have a genuinely representationalist reading of it, which is what they are resisting. So what's at issue is not settled by pointing out the declarative, pointing out that we can use all these kinds of language in declarative sentences. So descriptivism is too narrow, declarativism is too wide. One of Price's two master arguments against local expressivists that he used to drive Blackburn from only being an expressivist about the 3 M's, modals, morals, and mathematics, to at least flirting, in Blackburn's case, with a global pragmatism that would be globally anti-representationalist, is that Price points out, and this is the lesson he learns from the Geach argument, that if you're going to be a local anti-descriptivist or anti-representationalist, only give a non-representational semantic account of the use of some expressions or some uses of expressions, then you're committed to a bifurcation thesis. You're committed to there being a line between bits of discourse, the use of which in declarative sentences is describing how the world is or representing the world as being some way, and the declarative sentences which, though still truth evaluable and embeddable, is not properly given a representational or descriptive semantic analysis. And Price is going to argue, well, he's going to set very, very high criteria of adequacy for becoming entitled to a bifurcation thesis like that, to hiving off the properly representational or descriptive uses of the language. The argument of Price that the master argument that he uses to bring all these things together then, the expressivism and the pragmatism, is his distinction between subject naturalism and object naturalism, which comes up for him in addressing what Frank Jackson calls location problems, saying, look, if you think normative vocabulary is okay, then tell me how to understand these normative facts as located in the world that fundamental physics gives us. Physics says we can give you a complete description of the world by stating the physical facts, the world as described in the language of physics. And now if you think that in addition, there are these normative facts, so it can be true to say he ought not to have done that, or so-and-so is not a good person. If you think so, tell me how to find these facts in the world of physics, how to locate them there. And Price says, look, that's object naturalism. It's saying, well, you're representing the world as being a certain way, postulating a certain kind of fact, and I want to know how those facts relate to these other facts, the facts as stated in a physical vocabulary. One of the things that's remarkable about Price is that he came to his Rortian pragmatism from exactly a diametrically opposed direction than Rorty did. Price started out and still is a distinguished philosopher of physics. And he was worried about the significance, the semantic significance of time variables in fundamental physics, and as the title of his first book, The Arrow of Time. And he was driven to a non-representational treatment of time variables by considerations internal to the philosophy of physics. So he's, all together with Jackson in wanting to have a broadly naturalistic point of view, but he says there's more ways to be a naturalist than to see what you're doing as stating facts, describing ways the world could be. You can also be a naturalist about what you're doing when you say these things. And his reading of Wittgenstein and Wittgenstein's language games, the Game of the Slabs, and so on, has Wittgenstein as his master strategy when we're puzzled about, say, how to fit numbers into the world. What are these numbers? And Wittgenstein says, look, there's nothing mysterious about learning to count, is there? As long as we can be a naturalist about the practices of counting and then adding and subtracting and so on, of using the numbers, we needn't assume that when we use these words, we're representing things in the world, describing the world as a certain way. So Price wants us to be naturalists on the side of the subject, about the practices we're engaged in talking this way, rather than assuming that in talking this way, we're describing or representing the world as being some way. And he thinks that goes all the way down into fundamental physics, and that it has to understand, in particular, the use of the time variable there. So this is just a fascinating way of reading Wittgenstein, of arguing for an anti-representationalist point of view. That's the one far-off divine event towards which the whole creation of the course is moving, is to this Pricean synthesis and Price's arguments for what he recognizes and what Rorty recognized as a Rortian pragmatism. Rorty was a big fan of this distinction of Price. I mean, along the way, I won't be able to resist telling you how I think about many of these things. Rorty was my Doktorvater. I started off with these considerations, but I am not a global anti-representationalist. Hugh Price and I are at odds on this, but we won't principally be reading what I've had to say about this. It's just I won't be able to resist it slopping over and talking about it sometimes. I trust you've all looked at the website. I put the most imposing and terrifying picture of Rorty I could find on it. It's the Steve Pike photograph. You know, there's 2 volumes of his portraits of the philosophers. If you want to be really horrified, look at the volume 1 where the Rorty one is, and look at John McDowell in it. Pike likes to get right in the face of people, and anyway, this Rorty one is, but it's good. The pictures of the other figures are more canonical ones. I saw somebody on philosophy Twitter saw this syllabus online and performed a meme with it that my son had to explain to me. The used car dealer pats the roof of the syllabus and says, there's room for a whole lot of Rorty in this bad boy. And there is in this. You're going to read the crucial stuff. One thing you will notice is there's a lot of reading on this. And I urge you not to be daunted by that, but to do it. Force yourself to irradiate your retinae by all of these things. There is a lot of it, but it's mostly easy and fun to read. All the people we're going to read are good philosophical writers, and it by and large is not fussy stuff. I think important moves are being made, but you can pretty much read it at speed, and it's worth wading through all this stuff. If you do, at the end, you will be right at the cutting edge of this literature, of this debate that Hugh Price is one of the principal figures in, that I also participate in, that John McDowell does, downstream from Rorty. And along the way, we'll see the three substantially different phases that Rorty's thought went through. The final one, which I think people have not appropriately appreciated, because the Girona lectures, 10 lectures on pragmatism as anti-authoritarianism, were never published. We're putting them out in the coming year from Harvard, pulling them together for the first time. But we will read the stuff from that era. But roughly, Rorty had at least three major anti-representationalist arguments. One, an epistemological argument from Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature. We'll be reading that for next week. The other, this pragmatist master argument that I understand as having these two premises. One, representation has an essentially normative dimension, and two, we should be social practice pragmatists about norms and understand norms as always a matter of the role something plays in social practices. And then this third argument that is in some sense an essentially political argument that to finish the job of enlightenment, where the Enlightenment taught us in practical philosophy to stand on our own feet and not acknowledge the authority of anything non-human over our understanding of what we ought to do. That what the pragmatists are preaching, and he as their prophet, is a second enlightenment that extends that to the theoretical sphere. And that representational understanding of our practices is acknowledging the authority of something non-human, objective reality, what's represented, over our discursive practices, and that is beneath the dignity of post-enlightenment modern human beings. Now, I don't know whether that just strikes you as silly. I don't think it's silly. I think there really is something to that. That was the last decade of Rorty's life, was devoted to this picture of pragmatism as anti-authoritarianism. And so at the end of the first half of the course, the Rorty-Misak portion of the course, that's the stuff we'll be looking at. And then in the second half, mostly Price, but Blackburn is the sort of expressivist he needed to get a hold of here. And the process of Blackburn being convinced by a more global anti-representationalism, by a pragmatist expressivism, I think is quite telling. So this will bring you to the point, if you do the reading here, will bring you to the point where you can contribute to this conversation. In the first half of this session, I waved my hands at why I think big, deep, important conceptual issues are being contested here about how we should think about the concept of representation, what we should do with it, what it's good for, and what its pathologies are. So, okay, well, that's a prospectus of what's on offer. Let me repeat what I said at the beginning, because maybe not everybody was here. If you'd like to be kept up to date on the course, even if you might not be able to come to every session, and we'll be checking some of them out asynchronously, as we say now, by the recordings. If you're not registered for the course, send me an email saying that you want to be on the list in case I have to change the address of the Zoom room, or there's other updates that you need. And check in on the web page. I'm not running this through the Canvas system because people who aren't registered for the course can't really get into the Canvas system. So we intend to post links to the recordings and the transcripts. There should be, if all works out well, there should be a video recording, an audio recording, and a transcript of each of these. But so, I'll be updating the web page with those. But drop me an email just saying you want to be on the course distribution list if you do. Otherwise, I'll see you next week if you want to talk about philosophy in the mirror of nature. Okay. Thank you all then.